Arrival of Porcupine. A letter from Captain Marshall. Hopes of rescue. Treachery of the messenger. Igosigalonicha. The tables turned. Another gleam of hope. The Indian white teepee. Disappointed. A white man bound and left to starve. A burial incident. Before the Indians left this camping ground, there arrived among us an Indian called Porcupine. He was well dressed, and mounted on a fine horse, and brought with him presents and valuables, that ensured him a cordial reception. After he had been a few days in the village, he gave me a letter from Captain Marshall, of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, detailing the unsuccessful attempts that had been made to rescue me, and stating that this friendly Indian had undertaken to bring me back, for which he would be rewarded. The letter further said that he had already received a horse and necessary provisions for the journey, and had left his 3 wives, with 13 others, at the fort as hostages. My feelings on reading this letter were indescribable. My heart leaped with unaccustomed hope at this evidence of the efforts of my white friends in my behalf. But the next instant despair succeeded this gleam of happy anticipation, for I knew this faithless messenger would not be true to his promise, since he had joined the Sioux immediately after his arrival among them in a battle against the whites. My fears were not unfounded. Porcupine prepared to go back to the fort without me, disregarding my earnest prayers and entreaties. The chief found me useful, and determined to keep me. He believed that a woman who had seen so much of their deceitfulness and cruelty could do them injury at the fort, and might prevent their receiving annuities. Porcupine said he should report me as dead, or impossible to find, nor could I prevail on him to do anything to the contrary. When reminded of the possible vengeance of the soldiers on his wives, whom they had threatened to kill if he did not bring me back, he laughed. "The white soldiers are cowards," he replied. "They never kill women, and I will deceive them as I have done before." Saying this, he took his departure, nor could my most urgent entreaties induce the chief to yield his consent, and allow me to send a written message to my friends, or in any wise assure them of my existence. All hope of rescue departed, and sadly I turned again to the wearisome drudgery of my captive life. The young betrothed bride of the old chief was very gracious to me. On one occasion she invited me to join her in a walk. The day was cool, and the air temptingly balmy. "Down there," she said, pointing to a deep ravine, "come and walk there. It is cool and shady." I looked in the direction indicated, and then at the Indian girl, who became very mysterious in her manner as she whispered, "There are white people down there." "How far?" I asked, eagerly. "About 50 miles," she replied. "They have great guns, and men dressed in much buttons. Their wagons are drawn by horses with long ears." A fort, thought I, but remembering the treacherous nature of the people I was among, I repressed every sign of emotion, and tried to look indifferent. "Should you like to see them?" questioned Igosigalonicha, as she was called. "They are strangers to me," I said quietly. "I do not know them." "Are you sorry to live with us?" "You do not have such bread as I would like to eat," replied I, cautiously. "And are you dissatisfied with our home?" "You have some meat now. It is better than that at the other camping ground. There we had no food, and I suffered." "But your eyes are swollen and red," hinted she. "You do not weep for bread." These questions made me suspicious, and I tried to evade the young squaw, but in vain. "Just see how green that wood is," I said, affecting not to hear her. "But you do not say you are content," repeated she. "Will you stay here always, willingly?" "Come and listen to the birds," said I, drawing my companion toward the grove. I did not trust her, and feared to utter a single word, lest it might be used against me with the chief. Neither was I mistaken in the design of Igosigalonicha, for when we returned to the lodge, I overheard her relating to the chief the amusement she had enjoyed, in lying to the white woman, repeating what she had said about the fort, and inventing entreaties which I had used, urging her to allow me to fly to my white friends, and leave the Indians forever. Instantly I resolved to take advantage of the affair as a joke, and, approaching the chief with respectful pleasantry, begged to reverse the story. It was the squaw who had implored me to go with her to the white man's fort, I said, and find her a white warrior for a husband, but, true to my faith with the Indians, I refused. The wily Egosagalalnicha, thus finding her weapons turned against herself, appeared confused, and suddenly left the tent, at which the old chief smiled grimly. Slander, like a vile serpent, coils itself among these Indian women, and, as with our fair sisters in civilized society, when reality fails, invention is called in to supply the defect. They delight in scandal, and prove by it their claim to some of the refined conventionalities of civilized life. Porcupine had spread the news abroad in the village that a large reward had been offered for the white woman, consequently I was sought for, the motive being to gain the reward. One day an Indian, whom I had seen in different places, and whose wife I had known, made signs intimating a desire for my escape, and assuring me of his help to return to my people. I listened to his plans, and although I knew my position in such a case to be one of great peril, yet I felt continually that my life was of so little value that any opportunity, however slight, was as a star in the distance, and escape should be attempted even at a risk. We conversed as well as we could several times, and finally arrangements were made. At night he was to make a slight scratching noise at the tepee where I was, as a sign. The night came, but I was singing to the people and could not get away. Another time we had visitors in the lodge, and I would be missed. The next night I arose from my robe and went out into the darkness. Seeing my intended rescuer at a short distance, I approached and followed him. We ran hastily out of the village about a mile, where we were to be joined by the squaw who had helped make the arrangements and was favorable to the plan for my escape, but she was not there. White Tepee, that was the Indian's name, looked hastily around, and, seeing no one, darted suddenly away, without a word of explanation. Why the Indian acted thus I never knew. It was a strange proceeding. Fear lent me wings, and I flew, rather than ran, back to my tepee or lodge, where, exhausted and discouraged, I dropped on the ground and feigned slumber, for the inmates were already aroused, having just discovered my absence. Finding me apparently asleep, they lifted me up, and taking me into the tent, laid me upon my own robe. The next evening White Tepee sent for me to come to his lodge to a feast, where I was well and hospitably entertained, but not a sign given of the adventure of the previous night. But when the pipe was passed, he requested it to be touched to my lips, then offered it to the Great Spirit, thus signifying his friendship for me. In this month the Indians captured a white man, who was hunting on the prairie, and carried him far away from the haunts of white men, where they tied him hand and foot, after divesting him of all clothing, and left him to starve. He was never heard of afterward. There were twin children in one of the lodges, one of which sickened and died, and in the evening was buried. The surviving child was placed upon the scaffold by the corpse, and there remained all night, its crying and moaning almost breaking my heart. I inquired why they did this. The reply was, to cause the mate to mourn. The mother was on one of the neighboring hills, wailing and weeping, as is the custom among them. Every night nearly there were women among the hills wailing for their dead. End of chapter 13. Lost in the Indian Village. Black Bear's White Wife. A Small Tea Party. The White Boy Captive, Charles Sylvester. The Sun Dance. A Conciliating Letter from General Sibley. A Puzzle of Human Bones. The Indian as an Artist. I Destroy a Picture and am Punished with Firebrands. A Sick Indian. About the 1st of October, the Indians were on the move as usual, and by some means I became separated from the family I was with, and was lost. I looked around for them, but their familiar faces were not to be seen. Strangers gazed upon me, and, although I besought them to assist me in finding the people of my own tepee, they paid no attention to my trouble, and refused to do anything for me. Never shall I forget the sadness I felt as evening approached, and we camped for the night in a lonely valley, after a wearisome day's journey. Along one side stood a strip of timber, with a small stream beside it. Hungry, weary, and lost to my people, with no place to lay my head, and after a fruitless search for the family, I was more desolate than ever. Even Keokoo, or Yellow Bird, the Indian girl who had been given me, was not with me that day, making it still more lonely. I sat down and held my pony. It was autumn, and the forest wore the last glory of its gorgeous coloring. Already the leaves lay along the paths, like a rich carpet of variegated colors. The winds caught a deeper tone, mournful as the tones of an Aeolian harp, but the air was balmy and soft, and the sunlight lay warm and pleasant, as in midsummer, over the beautiful valley, now occupied with numberless camps of tentless Indians. It seemed as if the soft autumn weather was, to the last moment, unwilling to yield the last traces of beauty to the chill embraces of stern winter, and I thought of the luxuries and comforts of my home. I looked back on the past with tears of sorrow and regret. My heart was overburdened with grief, and I prayed to die. The future looked like a dark cloud approaching, for the dread of the desolation of winter to me was appalling. While meditating on days of the past, and contemplating the future, Keokoo came suddenly upon me, and was delighted to find the object of her search. They had been looking for me, and did not know where I had gone, were quite worried about me, she said, and she was glad she had found me. I was as pleased as herself, and rejoiced to join them. One has no idea of the extent of an Indian village, or of the number of its inhabitants. It would seem strange to some that I should ever get lost when among them, but, like a large city, one may be separated from their companions, and in a few moments be lost. The Indians all knew the white woman, but I knew but few comparatively, and consequently, when among strangers, I felt utterly friendless. The experience of those days of gloom and sadness seem like a fearful dream, now that my life is once again with civilized people, and enjoying the blessings that I was there deprived of. Some 25 years ago an emigrant train, en route for California, arrived in the neighborhood of the crossing of the North Platte, and the cholera broke out among the travelers, and every one died, with the exception of one little girl. The Indian Black Bear, while hunting, came to the wagons, now a morgue, and, finding the father of the girl dying with cholera, took the child in his arms. The dying parent begged him to carry his little one to his home in the East, assuring him of abundant reward by the child's friends, in addition to the gold he gave him. These facts I gleaned from a letter given to Black Bear by the dying father, and which had been carefully preserved by the daughter. Instead of doing as was desired, he took the money, child, and everything valuable in the train, to his own home among the hills, and there educated the little one with habits of savage life. She forgot her own language, her name, and everything about her past life, but she knew that she was white. Her infancy and girlhood were, therefore, passed in utter ignorance of the modes of life of her own people, and, contented and happy, she remained among them, verifying the old adage that habit is second nature. When she was of marriageable age, Black Bear took her for his wife, and they had a child, a boy. I became acquainted with this white woman shortly after I went into the village, and we were sincere friends, although no confidants, as I dared not trust her. It was very natural and pleasant also to know her, as she was white, and although she was an Indian in tastes and habits, she was my sister, and belonged to my people. There was a sympathetic cord between us, and it was a relief to be with her. On the occasion of my first visit with her, Black Bear suggested the idea that white women always drank tea together, so she made us a cup of herb tea, which we drank in company. I endeavored to enlighten her, and to do her all the good I could; told her of the white people, and of their kindness and Christianity, trying to impress her with the superiority of the white race, all of which she listened to with great interest. I was the only white woman she had seen, for whenever they neared any fort she was always kept out of sight. She seemed to enjoy painting herself, and dressing for the dances, as well as the squaws, and was happy and contented with Indian surroundings, for she knew no difference. I know not what has become of her, for I have never heard. Neither can I remember the name of her father, which was in the note handed the Indian by his dying hand. A little boy, 14 years old, whose name was Charles Sylvester, belonging in Quincy, Illinois, who was stolen when 7 years of age, was in the village, and one day I saw him playing with the Indian boys, and, discovering immediately that he was a white boy, I flew to his side, and tried to clasp him in my arms, in my joy exclaiming, "Oh, I knew you were a white boy! Speak to me, and tell me who you are, and where you come from." He also had forgotten his name and parentage, but knew that he was white. When I spoke to him, the boys began to plague and tease him, and he refused to speak to me, running away every time I approached him. 1 year after, one day, when this boy was out hunting, he killed a comrade by accident, and he dared not return to the village. So he escaped, on his pony, to the white people. On his way to the States, he called at a house where they knew what Indians he belonged to, and they questioned him whether he had seen a white woman in the village. He replied in the affirmative, and a bundle of pictures being given him, he picked mine out from among them, saying, "That is the white woman whom I saw." After a while, being discontented with his own people, he returned to his adopted friends on the North Platte, and became an interpreter and trader, and still remains there, doing business at various posts. When the Indians went to obtain their annuities, they transferred me to the Unkpapas, leaving me in their charge, where there was a young couple and an old Indian who had 4 wives. He had been very brave, it was said, for he had endured the trial which proves the successful warrior. He was one of those who "looked at the sun" without failing in heart or strength. This custom is as follows: the one who undergoes this operation is nearly naked, and is suspended from the upper end of a pole by a cord, which is tied to some splints which run through the flesh of both breasts. The weight of his body is hung from it, the feet still upon the ground helping support it a very little, and in his left hand he holds his favorite bow, and in his right, with a firm hold, his medicine bag. A great crowd usually looks on, sympathizing with and encouraging him, but he still continues to hang and "look at the sun," without paying the least attention to any one about him. The mystery men beat their drums, and shake their rattles, and sing as loud as they can yell, to strengthen his heart to look at the sun from its rising until its setting, at which time, if his heart and strength have not failed him, he is "cut down," receives a liberal donation of presents, which are piled before him during the day, and also the name and style of a doctor or medicine man, which lasts him and ensures him respect through life. It is considered a test of bravery. Superstition seems to have full sway among the Indians, just as much as in heathen lands beyond the sea, where the Burma mother casts her child to the crocodile to appease the Great Spirit. Many of these Indians were from Minnesota, and were of the number that escaped justice 2 years before, after committing an indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children. One day I was sent for by one of them, and when I was seated in his lodge, he gave me a letter to read, which purported to have been written by General Sibley, as follows: "This Indian, after taking part in the present outbreak of the Indians against the white settlers and missionaries, being sick, and not able to keep up with his friends in their flight, we give you the offerings of friendship, food, and clothing. You are in our power, but we won't harm you. Go to your people and gladden their hearts. Lay down your weapons and fight the white men no more. We will do you good and not evil. Take this letter, in it we have spoken. Depart in peace, and evermore be a friend to the white people, and you will be more happy. H. H. Sibley, Brigadier General Commanding Expedition. Instinctively I looked up into his face and said, "Intend to keep your promise?" He laughed derisively at the idea of an Indian brave abandoning his profession. He told of many instances of outrageous cruelties of his band in their marauding and murderous attacks on traveling parties and frontier settlers; and further, to assure me of his bravery, he showed me a puzzle or game he had made from the finger bones of some of the victims that had fallen beneath his tomahawk. The bones had been freed from the flesh by boiling, and, being placed upon a string, were used for playing some kind of Indian game. This is but one of the heathenish acts of these Indians. The Indians were fond of recounting their exploits, and, savage-like, dwell with much satisfaction upon the number of scalps that they have taken from their white foes. They would be greatly amused at the shuddering horror manifested, when, to annoy me, they would tauntingly portray the dying agonies of white men, women, and children, who had fallen into their hands; and especially would the effect of their description of the murder of little Mary afford them satisfaction. I feel now that I must have been convinced of her death, yet I could not then help hoping that she had escaped. These exploits and incidents were generally related by the Indians when in camp having nothing to do. The great lazy brutes would sit by the hour, making caricatures of white soldiers, representing them in various ways, and always as cowards and inferior beings; sometimes as in combat, but always at their mercy. This was frequently done, apparently to annoy me, and one day, losing patience, I snatched a rude drawing from the hands of an Indian, who was holding it up to my view, and tore it in two, clasping the part that represented the white soldier to my heart, and throwing the other into the fire. Then, looking up, I told them the white soldiers were dear to me, that they were my friends and I loved them. I said they were friends to the Indians, and did not want to harm them. I expressed myself in the strongest manner by words and signs. Never did I see a more enraged set of men. They assailed me with burning firebrands, burning me severely. They heated the points of arrows, and burned and threatened me sorely. I told them I meant no harm to them, that it was ridiculous their getting angry at my burning a bit of paper. I promised I would make them some more, that they should have pictures of my drawing, when at last I pacified them. They were much like children in this respect, easily offended but very difficult to please. I was constantly annoyed, worried, and terrified by their strange conduct, their transition from laughing and fun to anger and even rage. I knew not how to get along with them. One moment they would seem friendly and kind; the next, if any act of mine displeased them, their faces were instantly changed, and they displayed their hatred or anger in unmeasured words or conduct; children one hour, the next fiends. I always tried to please them, and was as cheerful as I could be under the circumstances, for my own sake. One day I was called to see a man who lay in his tepee in great suffering. His wasted face was darkened by fever, and his brilliantly restless eyes rolled anxiously, as if in search of relief from pain. He was reduced to a skeleton, and had endured tortures from the suppuration of an old wound in the knee. He greeted me with the how of Indian politeness, and in answer to my inquiry why he came to suffer so, he replied, "I go fight white man. He take away land and chase game away. Then he take away our squaws. He take away my best squaw." Here his voice choked, and he displayed much emotion. Pitying his misery, I endeavored to aid him, and rendered him all the assistance in my power, but death was then upon him. The medicine man was with him also, practicing his incantations. We were so constantly traveling, it wearied me beyond expression. The day after the Indians' burial, we were again on the move. Chapter 14. Preparing the Chi-Cha-Cha, or Killikinick. Attack on Captain Fisk's emigrant train. 14 whites killed. A big haul of whiskey. A drunken debauch. I write a letter to Captain Fisk under dictation. Poisoned Indians. The train saved by my clerical strategy. One of the occupations given me, while resting in the villages between war times, was to prepare the bark of a red willow called Killikinick, for smoking instead of tobacco. They discovered that I could sing, and groups of idle warriors would gather around me before the tent, urging me to sing as I worked. A dreary, dreary task, chanting to please my savage companions, while I rubbed and prepared the bark of willow, my heart ready to burst with grief. On the 5th of September they went to battle, and surprised a portion of Captain Fisk's men passing in escorting an emigrant train. 14 of whom they killed, and captured 2 wagons loaded with whiskey, wines, and valuable articles. There was a quantity of silverware and stationery also taken by them. Among the articles captured and brought into camp were a number of pickles in glass jars, which the Indians tasted. The result was comical in the extreme, for there is nothing that an Indian abhors more than a strong acid. The faces they made can be imagined but not described. Thinking they might be improved by cooking, they placed the jars in the fire, when of course they exploded, very much to their disgust for the "white man's kettles." I could hear the firing plainly, and when they returned that night in triumph, bringing with them the plundered stores, they committed every description of extravagant demonstration. In the wild orgies which followed, they mocked and groaned in imitation of the dying, and went through a horrid mimicry of the butchery they had perpetrated. They determined to go out again and capture a quantity of horses corralled in the neighborhood, and sweep the train and soldiers with wholesale massacre, but they feared the white man's cannon, and deliberated on means of surprising by ambush, which is their only idea of warfare. Indians are not truly brave, though they are vain in the name of courage. Cunning, stealth, strategy, and deceit are the weapons they use in attack. They endure pain, because they are taught from infancy that it is cowardly to flinch, but they will never stand to fight if they can strike secretly and escape. Fearing the cannon, yet impatient for the spoil almost within view, the Indians waited for 3 days for the train to move on and leave them free to attack. For 2 days I implored and begged on my knees to be allowed to go with them, but to no avail. At last I succeeded in inducing them to allow me to write, as they knew I understood the nature of correspondence, and they procured for me the necessary appliances and dictated a letter to Captain Fisk, assuring him that the Indians were weary of fighting, and advising him to go on in peace and safety. Knowing their malicious designs, I set myself to work to circumvent them, and although the wily chief counted every word dictated, and as they were marked on paper, I contrived, by joining them together and condensing the information I gave, to warn the officer of the perfidious intentions of the savages, and tell him briefly of my helpless and unhappy captivity. The letter was carefully examined by the chief, and the number of its apparent words recounted. At length, appearing satisfied with its contents, he had it carried to a hill in sight of the soldiers' camp, and stuck on a pole. In due time the reply arrived, and again my ingenuity was tasked to read the letter corresponding with the number of words that would not condemn me. The captain's real statement was, that he distrusted all among the savages, and had great reason to. On reading Captain Fisk's words, that seemed to crush my already awakened hopes, my emotion overcame me. Having told the Indians that the captain doubted their friendliness, and explained the contents of the letter as I thought best, the next day I was entrusted with the task of writing again, to solemnly assure the soldiers of the faith and friendship professed. Again I managed to communicate with them, and this time begged them to use their field glasses, and that I would find an excuse for standing on the hills in the afternoon, that they might see for themselves that I was what I represented myself to be, a white woman held in bondage. The opportunity I desired was gained, and to my great delight, I had a chance of standing so as to be seen by the men of the soldiers' camp. I had given my own name in every communication. As soon as the soldiers saw that it truly was a woman of their own race, and that I was in the power of their enemies, the excitement of their feelings became so great that they desired immediately to rush to my rescue. A gentleman belonging to the train generously offered $800 for my ransom, which was all the money he had, and the noble, manly feeling displayed in my behalf did honor to those who felt it. There was not a man in the train who was not willing to sacrifice all he had for my rescue. Captain Fisk restrained all hasty demonstrations, and even went so far as to say that the first man who moved in the direction of the Indian camp should be shot immediately, his experience enabling him to know that a move of that kind would result fatally to them and to the captive. The Indians found a box of crackers saturated with water, and, eating of them, sickened and died. I afterward learned that some persons with the train who had suffered the loss of dear relatives and friends in the massacre of Minnesota, and who had lost their all, had poisoned the crackers with strychnine, and left them on one of their camping grounds without the captain's knowledge. The Indians told me afterward that more had died from eating bad bread than from bullets during the whole summer campaign. Captain Fisk deserves great credit for his daring and courage, with his meager supply of men, against so large an army of red men. After assurance of my presence among them, Captain Fisk proceeded to treat quietly with the savages on the subject of a ransom, offering to deliver in their village 3 wagon loads of stores as a price for their prisoner. To this the deceitful creatures pretended readily to agree, and the tortured captive, understanding their tongue, heard them making fun of the credulity of white soldiers who believed their promises. I had the use of a field glass from the Indians, and with it I saw my white friends, which almost made me wild with excited hope. Knowing what the Indians had planned, and dreading lest the messengers should be killed, as I knew they would be if they came to the village, I wrote to Captain Fisk of the futility of ransoming me in that way, and warned him of the treachery intended against his messengers. Note: the original letters written by me to Captain Fisk are now on file in the War Department at Washington. Officially certified extracts from the correspondence are published elsewhere in this work. No tongue can tell, or pen describe, those terrible days, when, seemingly lost to hope and surrounded by drunken Indians, my life was in constant danger. Nights of horrible revelry passed, when, forlorn and despairing, I lay listening, only half consciously, to the savage mirth and wild exultation. To no overtures would the Indians listen, declaring I could not be purchased at any price. They were determined not to part with me. Captain Fisk and his companions were sadly disappointed in not obtaining my release, and, after a hopeless attempt, he made known the fact of my being a prisoner, spreading the news far and wide. His expeditions across the plains had always been successful, and the Indians, knowing him to be very brave, gave him the name of Great Chief who knows no fear, and he richly deserves the appellation, for the expeditions were attended with great danger. The reports of his various expeditions have been published by government, and are very interesting, giving a description of the country. In September the rains were very frequent, sometimes continuing for days. This may not seem serious to those who have always been accustomed to a dwelling and a good bed, but to me, who had no shelter, and whose shrinking form was exposed to the pitiless storm, and naught but the cold ground to lie upon, bringing the pains and distress of rheumatism, it was a calamity hard to bear, and I often prayed fervently to God to give me sweet release in a flight to the land where there were no storms. Soon the winter would be upon us, and the cold, and sleet, and stormy weather would be difficult to bear. Would I be so fortunate, would Heaven be so gracious as to place me in circumstances where the wintry winds could not chill or make me suffer. My heart seemed faint at the thought of what was before me, for hope was lessening as winter approached. End of chapter 15. Scenes on Cannonball Prairie. Reflections. Well do I remember my thoughts and feelings when first I beheld the mighty and beautiful prairie of Cannonball River. With what singular emotions I beheld it for the first time. I could compare it to nothing but a vast sea, changed suddenly to earth, with all its heaving, rolling billows. Thousands of acres lay spread before me like a mighty ocean, bounded by nothing but the deep blue sky. What a magnificent sight! A sight that made my soul expand with lofty thought, and its frail tenement sink into utter nothingness before it. Well do I remember my sad thoughts and the turning of my mind upon the past, as I stood alone upon a slight rise of ground, and overlooked miles upon miles of the most lovely, the most sublime scene I had ever beheld. Wave upon wave of land stretched away on every hand, covered with beautiful green grass and the blossoming wild flowers of the prairie. Occasionally I caught glimpses of wild animals, while flocks of birds of various kinds and beautiful plumage, skimming over the surface here and there, alighting or departing upward from the earth, added life and beauty and variety to this most enchanting scene. It had been a beautiful day, and the sun was now just burying himself in the far-off ocean of blue, and his golden rays were streaming along the surface of the waving grass and tinging it with a delightful hue. Occasionally some elevated point caught and reflected back his rays to the one I was standing upon, and it would catch, for a moment, his fading rays, and glow like a ball of golden fire. Slowly he took his diurnal farewell, as if loath to quit a scene so lovely, and at last hid himself from my view beyond the western horizon. I stood and marked every change with that poetical feeling of pleasant sadness which a beautiful sunset rarely fails to awaken in the breast of the lover of nature. I noted every change that was going on, and yet my thoughts were far, far away. I thought of the hundreds of miles that separated me from the friends that I loved. I was recalling the delight with which I had, when a little girl, viewed the farewell scenes of day from so many romantic hills and lakes and rivers, rich meadows, mountain gorge and precipice, and the quiet hamlets of my dear native land so far away. I fancied I could see my mother move to the door, with a slow step and heavy heart, and gaze, with yearning affection, toward the broad, the mighty west, and sigh, wondering what had become of her lost child. I thought, and grew more sad as I thought, until tears filled my eyes. Mother! What a world of affection is comprised in that single word! How little do we, in the giddy round of youthful pleasure and folly, heed her wise counsels! How lightly do we look upon that zealous care with which she guides our otherwise erring feet, and watches with feelings which none but a mother can know, the gradual expansion of our youth to the riper years of discretion. We may not think of it then, but it will be recalled to our minds in after years, when the gloomy grave, or a fearful living separation, has placed her far beyond our reach, and her sweet voice of sympathy and consolation for the various ills attendant upon us sounds in our ears no more. How deeply then we regret 1,000 deeds that we have done contrary to her gentle admonitions! How we sigh for those days once more, that we may retrieve what we have done amiss, and make her kind heart glad with happiness! Alas! once gone, they can never be recalled, and we grow mournfully sad with the bitter reflection. "Oh, my mother!" I cried aloud, "my dearly beloved mother! Would I ever behold her again? Should I ever return to my native land? Would I find her among the living? If not, heavens! what a sad, what a painful thought!" And instantly I found my eyes swimming in tears, and my frame trembling with nervous agitation. But I would hope for the best. Gradually I became calm. Then I thought of my husband, and what might be his fate. It was sad at best, I well knew. And lastly, though I tried to avoid it, I thought of Mary. Sweet, lost, but dearly beloved Mary. I could see her gentle features. I could hear her plaintive voice, soft and silvery as running waters, and sighed a long, deep sigh as I thought of her murdered. Could I never behold her again? No, she was dead, perished by the cruel, relentless savage. Silence brooded over the world. Not a sound broke the solemn repose of nature. The summer breeze had rocked itself to rest in the willow boughs, and the broad-faced, familiar moon seemed alive and toiling as it climbed slowly up a cloudless sky, passing starry sentinels, whose nightly challenge was lost in vast vortices of blue as they paced their ceaseless round in the mighty camp of constellations. With my eyes fixed upon my gloomy surroundings of tyranny, occasionally a slip of moonshine silvered the ground. I watched and reflected. Oh, hallowed days of my blessed girlhood! They rise before me now like holy burning stars breaking out in a stormy, howling night, making the blackness blacker still. The short, happy springtime of life, so full of noble aspirations and glowing hopes of my husband's philanthropic schemes of charitable projects in the future. We had planned so much for the years to come, when, prosperous and happy, we should be able to distribute some happiness among those whose fate might be mingled with ours, and in the pursuit of our daily avocations we would find joy and peace. But alas for human hopes and expectations! It is thus with our life. We silently glide along, little dreaming of the waves which will so soon sweep over us, dashing us against the rocks, or stranding us forever. We do not dream that we shall ever wreck, until the greater wave comes over us, and we bend beneath its power. If some mighty hand could unroll the future to our gaze, or set aside the veil which enshrouds it, what pictures would be presented to our trembling hearts? No, let it be as the All-Wise hath ordained, a closed-up tomb, only revealed as the events occur, for could we bear them with the fortitude we should, if they were known beforehand? Shrinking from it, we would say, "Let the cup pass from me." Chapter 17